It started like any other quiet morning in the neighborhood. The sun was just starting to warm the roofs, and the smell of fresh-cut grass drifted through the air. I was in my kitchen, sipping my first coffee of the day, when my phone buzzed with a notification. At first, I thought it was just another community update from the HOA, the kind of emails that usually talk about painting fences or trimming bushes. But when I opened it, my stomach twisted. It wasn't a friendly reminder, it was a formal notice. According to them, I owed thousands of dollars in unpaid HOA fees. I read it again, thinking maybe I'd misread. But no, the words were right there in black and white. Final warning in big bold letters. It didn't make any sense. I'd never missed a payment. I always paid my bills early. My mind went straight to wondering if it was some sort of scam email, but the letterhead, the details, everything looked official. For a moment, I just stood there holding my phone, the coffee turning cold in my hand. I told myself it had to be a mistake, something easy to clear up with a quick phone call. But even then, a part of me couldn't shake the uneasy feeling crawling up my spine. I walked over to my desk, pulled out my file of HOA payment receipts, and started flipping through them. Every single month was accounted for. The dates, the amounts, the bank confirmations, everything matched perfectly. I even double-checked my online banking history, just to be sure. And still, I couldn't find a single missing payment. That's when I decided to call the HOA office. The phone rang a few times before a voice I knew all too well answered. It was Karen, the HOA president. She always had this clipped, sharp tone in her voice, like she was already annoyed before you even said a word. I explained the notice I'd received and told her there must be a mistake. She didn't sound surprised at all. In fact, it felt like she was expecting my call. "You're behind on your payments," she said flatly, as if it was a fact carved in stone. I tried to explain that I had proof I wasn't, but she cut me off, saying the records showed otherwise. Then she mentioned something that made my jaw drop. She had already contacted the police. For a second, I didn't even know what to say. My mind raced. The police? Over HOA fees? I thought maybe she was bluffing, trying to scare me into paying money I didn't know. But the tone in her voice told me she wasn't bluffing. She seemed almost smug about it, like she enjoyed the idea of me panicking. That was when my heart started pounding. I'm not someone who's ever been in trouble with the law. The thought of having the police show up at my door over something so absurd made my hands shake. I asked her how much I supposedly owed, and she rattled off an amount so high it could have paid for a used car. My brain struggled to process it. I reminded her that I had every single receipt, but she only told me that sometimes people think they've paid, but they haven't. The way she said it made it clear she wasn't interested in listening. Her mind was made up. After hanging up, I sat there in silence, staring at my stack of receipts. None of it added up. Not the sudden debt, not the amount, not the timing. And certainly not the fact that the president of the HOA herself was the one pushing this so aggressively. I started thinking back over the past few months. There had been small signs, Karen dropping little comments about people who don't contribute, making pointed remarks at HOA meetings about certain residents who were falling behind. I'd brushed them off at the time, figuring she was talking about someone else. But now the puzzle pieces started clicking together in a way I didn't like. I couldn't just let it go. If she'd really contacted the police, this could turn into something serious. I grabbed a notebook and started jotting down every date and detail I could remember. When I'd made each payment, when I'd spoken to her, even the little passive-aggressive notes she'd left on my mailbox before. The more I wrote, the more my confusion started turning into determination. If this was a mistake, I'd prove it. If it wasn't a mistake, then Karen was deliberately trying to pin her problem on me. And if that was true, I wanted to know why. But before I could even start digging, my phone buzzed again. This time, it wasn't an email. It was a voicemail from a local police officer, asking me to call back about a financial dispute reported by my HOA. My mouth went dry. It wasn't just talk. She had actually done it. I replayed the message 3 times, each time feeling the knot in my stomach grow tighter. I'd never had to call the police for anything in my life, and now I had to call them to explain that I wasn't some deadbeat skipping out on my bills. Taking a deep breath, I dialed the number. The officer was polite but direct. He asked if I was aware of the complaint. I explained everything I could in the moment, telling him I had documents to prove the debt wasn't mine. He said he'd be in touch once he looked over the report from the HOA. After hanging up, I leaned back in my chair and stared at the ceiling. It was clear now, this wasn't going to just blow over. Karen wasn't just making a clerical error. She was pushing this like her life depended on it. And I couldn't help but wonder why. The next morning, I woke up with that same heavy feeling in my chest. I barely slept. Every time I closed my eyes, I pictured flashing police lights outside my house, neighbors peeking through their curtains, whispering about how I'd been taken away over some ridiculous unpaid bill. The more I thought about it, the more I realized this wasn't just about money anymore. This was personal. I decided I wasn't going to sit around waiting for things to get worse. I grabbed my coffee, sat at my desk, and opened up my laptop. First, I pulled every HOA statement from the past 2 years. Then I opened my bank records. Payment after payment lined up perfectly, same dates, same amounts. I made a spreadsheet, marking every one. There wasn't a single gap. But as I compared them, I noticed something odd. Some of the charges on the HOA's official statements didn't match what I'd actually paid. Not in a small way, either. We're talking hundreds of dollars in difference. I stared at one in particular, a special assessment fee for landscaping. The amount was huge, and I had no memory of approving it. The kicker? My copy of the statement didn't even have that fee listed. That was the first crack in the wall. If my records didn't match theirs, something was wrong on their end. And the more I looked, the more cracks I found. It was like someone had cut and pasted parts of my account history with charges that didn't belong to me. I printed everything out and put it in a binder. Receipts in one section, bank records in another, HOA statements in the last. I wasn't going to show up empty-handed to whatever came next. By noon, I decided to pay Karen a visit. The HOA office was only a few blocks away, a small brick building with a fake plant in the window and a bell over the door that jingled when you walked in. She was there, sitting behind her desk, typing away like she owned the place. Which, in her mind, she probably thought she did. She didn't even bother to smile. "Here to pay your debt?" she asked, not looking up from her computer. I set the binder down on her desk, hard enough to make her stop typing. "Here to show you I don't owe a penny," I said. Her eyes flicked to the binder, then back to me, like she couldn't decide whether to laugh or roll her eyes. She opened the first page, glanced at the neatly organized receipts, and let out a short, fake laugh. "You can make all the spreadsheets you want," she said, "but our records are the official ones." "Your records are wrong," I shot back. "These charges aren't mine. Some of them aren't even from my address." That made her freeze for just a second. Not long enough for most people to notice, but I saw it, the way her hand paused over the page, the slight tightening around her mouth. She recovered quickly, closing the binder and pushing it back toward me. "If you have an issue, take it up with the police. I've already sent them my report." That was all I needed to hear. She wasn't going to fix this. She wasn't even going to try. And the way she avoided my eyes told me she knew exactly what she was doing. I left the office, binder under my arm, and sat in my car for a few minutes, trying to process everything. My gut told me this was bigger than just a mix-up. If her own charges were somehow ending up on my account, it wasn't by accident. But how could I prove it? That's when I thought of something. A neighbor had once told me about a small accounting firm the HOA used for their records. If I could get access to the raw data before Karen edited it for her reports, maybe I could find the smoking gun. I drove straight there, a little strip mall office with faded lettering on the glass door. Inside, a middle-aged man in a button-down shirt looked up from his desk. I explained that I was a resident dealing with a billing dispute and asked if he could confirm something for me. At first, he was hesitant, confidentiality rules and all that, but when I showed him the police voicemail on my phone, his expression shifted. "Wait here," he said, disappearing into the back. When he came back, he had a stack of printouts. "These are the transactions tied to your account for the past year," he said, handing them over. I scanned the pages, my eyes darting over the numbers until I spotted them. The landscaping fee, the extra assessments, all linked to a completely different lot number. I looked up at him. "Whose lot is this?" He hesitated, then sighed. "That's the HOA president's property." There it was. The moment everything clicked into place. The bills weren't just random, they were hers. Somehow, either through sloppy bookkeeping or deliberate manipulation, she'd made them mine. And if the accountant had these records, it meant the police could have them too. I thanked him, tucked the papers into my binder, and walked out feeling a mix of relief and fury. Relief that I finally had proof. Fury that she'd dragged me through this just to cover her own debts. Driving home, I kept thinking about how calm she'd been in the office, how confident she was that nothing could touch her. But she hadn't counted on me finding this. Now, I had the receipts, literally and figuratively. And I knew exactly what my next step had to be. I didn't waste any time. The moment I got home, I spread everything out on my dining table. My receipts, my bank records, the HOA statements, and now the accountant's printouts. The papers covered every inch of the surface, like pieces of a giant puzzle. The picture was clear to me now, but I knew the trick would be making it just as clear to the police. I grabbed a highlighter and started marking the charges that didn't belong. Every landscaping fee, every extra special assessment, every inflated utility cost, all of them connected to that other lot number. It was almost laughable how sloppy it was. The same dates showed up on both accounts, the same amounts, even the same descriptions. It was as if she'd copied and pasted her own bills directly onto mine. Once I had everything color-coded, I typed up a short timeline. I listed the date I got the first notice, the day I called her, the exact moment she told me the police were involved, and when I visited her office. I included my trip to the accountant's office, noting his confirmation about whose lot number it actually was. I didn't want there to be a single gap in the chain of events. By late afternoon, I had a folder ready, clear, organized, and impossible to ignore. I dialed the officer who'd left me the voicemail. When he answered, I told him I had evidence he needed to see in person. There was a pause on the other end before he said, "Come by the station tomorrow morning. Bring everything." The next day, I walked into the police station with the folder tucked under my arm. My hands were steady now. No fear, no second-guessing, just focus. The officer led me into a small interview room with a metal table and 2 chairs. I set the folder down and began walking him through each page. He listened quietly at first, leaning over the documents, occasionally asking me to point out specific entries. When I showed him the lot number mismatch, his eyebrows went up. I handed him the accountant's printouts, and he studied them for a long moment before leaning back in his chair. "So, these extra charges aren't yours?" he asked, even though the answer was obvious. "They're hers," I said, my voice firm. "The HOA president's. And she's been telling you I'm the one who owes them." He nodded slowly. "That's not a small accusation." "It's not an accusation," I said, sliding the last piece of paper across the table. "It's a fact, and you've got her accountant's signature on it." He tapped the papers, thinking. Then he said something that made my chest loosen for the first time in days. "All right, I'm going to need to speak with her." When I left the station, the sun was brighter, the air lighter. I wasn't in the clear yet, but I could feel the momentum shifting. She'd been so sure she could push this narrative without question. Now, she was going to have to answer for it. That afternoon, I kept busy. I didn't want to just sit around waiting for news. I mowed the lawn, sorted the garage, even cleaned out the fridge. Anything to keep my mind occupied. But every so often, I'd catch myself glancing at my phone, wondering if I'd get a call. It came sooner than I expected. Early evening, my phone lit up with the officer's number. When I answered, his tone was measured but not unfriendly. "We spoke with Ms. Karen today," he said. She had a lot to say, but when confronted with the documents, she didn't have a good explanation. I didn't interrupt. I just let him talk. "She claimed it was a bookkeeping error," he continued. "Said she didn't realize the charges were being billed to the wrong account. But according to the accountant, those transactions had been manually entered. Manually entered. Not automatic, not a glitch, typed in by someone's own hand. Where does that leave us?" I asked. "Well," he said, "it means we're treating this as a potential fraud case. We'll be looking into whether this was intentional. In the meantime, you're not responsible for the charges. Your record with us is clean." The relief hit me in waves. My record was clean. No one was coming to arrest me over a debt that wasn't mine. But under that relief was something sharper, something I'd been feeling since the first notice landed in my inbox: anger. She'd tried to ruin my name, drag me through the mud, maybe even get me in legal trouble, all while covering her own tracks. And if the police were now calling it fraud, then she might have to face the same fear she'd tried to put on me. After I hung up, I stood at my kitchen window, looking out at the street. Everything looked normal: kids riding bikes, neighbors watering lawns. But I knew somewhere behind one of those neatly painted doors, Karen was probably fuming. Maybe she was already plotting her next move, or maybe she was finally realizing she'd gone too far. Either way, I wasn't the same person I'd been at the start of this. I wasn't just going to let her brush this off as a mistake. If there was one thing I'd learned in the past few days, it was that people like her counted on others staying quiet. And I had no intention of being quiet. The next morning, I woke up earlier than usual, my mind already buzzing. The officer's words from the night before replayed in my head. Potential fraud case. That wasn't just a slip-up. That was serious. And if it was serious for the police, it was going to be serious for her. I made myself a strong cup of coffee and sat at the table with my folder again. Even though I'd already shown the evidence, I wanted to go through it one more time. Every highlighted line, every mismatched lot number, every bank record. I wanted it burned into my memory, in case anyone tried to twist the facts. Halfway through my coffee, there was a knock on the door. It wasn't the sharp, impatient knock of someone looking for a fight. It was steady, almost polite. When I opened the door, the last person I expected to see was standing there, Karen. She was dressed like she was going to a meeting, neat blazer, hair perfectly done, but there was a tightness around her eyes. She gave me a small, strained smile that didn't reach her face. "Can we talk?" she asked. Every instinct told me to slam the door. But curiosity, and maybe a little satisfaction, kept me from doing it. I stepped aside and let her in. She walked in like she owned the place, her heels clicking on the hardwood. I stayed standing while she sat at the table, looking around like she was gathering her thoughts. "I think we've had a misunderstanding," she began. "Is that what you call it?" I asked, keeping my voice calm. She let out a short breath. "Look, the police are making this into something bigger than it is. It was just a clerical error. No harm was meant." I leaned on the back of a chair, studying her. "A clerical error that put your bills on my account? That you manually entered? And then you called the police on me for not paying them." Her lips pressed into a thin line. "It wasn't intentional. I was going through a lot." I cut her off. "You dragged my name through the mud. You tried to get me arrested. That's not a mistake. That's a choice." For a second, the polished facade cracked. Her eyes narrowed, and I saw a flash of the person she really was. The one who liked being in control. The one who thought rules didn't apply to her. But just as quickly, she smoothed it over. "I came here to make things right," she said, her tone softer now. "If you drop this with the police, I'll make sure your HOA fees are reduced for the rest of the year. I'll even write a letter clearing your name." It took everything in me not to laugh. "So, you're offering me a bribe?" Her expression tightened again. "I'm offering you a way out of a messy situation." I shook my head. "The messy situation is yours, not mine." She stood then, her chair scraping the floor. "Fine. But when this blows over, and it will, don't expect things to be easy for you in this neighborhood." There it was, the threat. Plain and simple. She wasn't apologizing. She wasn't even really trying to make amends. She was trying to protect herself. I opened the door and stood aside. "Goodbye, Karen." She walked out without another word, her heels clicking all the way down the sidewalk. I closed the door, locking it, and just stood there for a moment. My hands were steady, but my mind was racing. She was scared, that much was obvious. But she was also dangerous when cornered. Later that day, I got another call from the officer. He said they'd be moving forward with interviewing more people from the HOA board. Apparently, I wasn't the only one with billing errors in my account history. A few other residents had smaller, unexplained charges over the past year. Nothing as big as mine, but enough to raise questions. That was the moment I realized she might have been doing this for a while. Maybe I was just the unlucky one who caught on. Or maybe she thought I'd be the easiest to intimidate. Either way, she'd picked the wrong person. I spent the afternoon talking to a couple of neighbors I trusted. I didn't go into every detail, but I told them enough for them to check their own statements. One of them, an older man who'd lived here for 20 years, called me back an hour later. He'd found a charge from last spring for a roof repair that never happened. By evening, I had a small list of people who were suspicious about their bills. It wasn't proof, not yet, but it was a pattern. And patterns were hard to explain away. I sat outside on my porch as the sun went down, thinking about how fast things had shifted. Just days ago, I'd been the one under suspicion, my reputation on the line. Now, she was the one being looked at, the one who had to explain herself. But something told me this wasn't over. Not by a long shot. That night, I barely slept again, but it wasn't from fear this time. It was from running through every possible angle in my head. I knew Karen wasn't the type to back down quietly. She'd already shown she was willing to lie, twist the truth, and even drag in the police to get her way. If she felt cornered, she might try something bigger. I had to be ready for whatever came next. By morning, I had a plan. I decided to make copies of every single piece of evidence I had, physical and digital. One set stayed with me, One went to a trusted friend outside the neighborhood, and one went into a locked safe. That way, even if something happened to my originals, the trail wouldn't disappear. Around mid-morning, my phone buzzed again. This time, it wasn't the police. It was a number I didn't recognize. When I answered, a calm voice introduced herself as an investigator working with the county's financial crimes unit. She said the police had forwarded my case to them for review and that she wanted to set up a meeting. That was when it hit me. This wasn't just a neighborhood squabble anymore. This had officially moved into a higher level of investigation. We met that afternoon at her office downtown. She was sharp, professional, and asked questions in a way that made it clear she already suspected the truth. I laid out my binder on her desk and walked her through it step by step, just like I had with the officer. She asked for the accountant's contact information, then made a note about the other residents who'd found suspicious charges. When I mentioned that Karen had shown up at my house the day before, trying to cut a deal, the investigator's eyebrows lifted slightly. Did she make any threats? She told me things wouldn't be easy for me here if I didn't drop it, I said. That seemed to go straight into her notes. Good, she said. That's important. After the meeting, I left feeling like the walls were closing in on Karen. But I also knew she'd probably sensed it too. Sure enough, later that evening, she made her next move. I was pulling into my driveway when I saw her standing on the sidewalk with two other members of the HOA board. They were talking in low voices, glancing toward my house. The moment they saw me, the conversation stopped, and they all gave me tight, cold smiles. Evening, I said, walking toward my front door. Karen stepped forward just enough to make it awkward. We're just checking in on some community matters, she said, her tone dripping with false sweetness. By the way, there will be an HOA meeting this weekend. Attendance is strongly encouraged. I knew exactly what she was doing. She wanted me in that meeting, so she could try to spin the narrative in front of the other residents. Maybe make me look like the troublemaker. I didn't give her the satisfaction of reacting. I just nodded, unlocked my door, and went inside. As soon as I was in, I texted the investigator about the upcoming meeting. She responded almost immediately, *go, and record everything you can, *. That weekend came faster than I expected. The meeting was in the community hall, a low-ceilinged room with folding chairs and a podium at the front. People were already murmuring when I walked in, some looking curious, others avoiding my gaze. Karen was at the podium, shuffling papers. When the meeting started, she ran through the usual topics, lawn care, parking rules, upcoming events, before casually sliding into the issue of unpaid dues. She didn't say my name at first, but it was clear who she meant. She painted herself as the diligent president trying to collect overdue fees from a non-compliant resident. She left out the part where those fees were hers. She spoke about misunderstandings and uncooperative behavior, her voice steady and confident. When she finally gestured toward me, the room shifted. Every eye was on me. She asked if I had anything to add before the board made a decision about possible penalties. I stood, feeling the quiet stretch across the room. Actually, I said, I do have something to add. I pulled out my binder and held it up. Every charge she's accusing me of comes from her own property's account. I have the records here, signed by the HOA's own accountant, showing it. And the police have them too. A few gasps went around the room. Karen's face didn't change much, but her knuckles whitened as she gripped the podium. I also have confirmation from a county investigator, I went on, that this matter is now part of a fraud investigation. And I'm not the only one she's overcharged. That's when I saw it, the flicker in the crowd. A couple of residents exchanged looks, and one older woman raised her hand. I think I have a charge like that on my bill, she said. Another man nodded. Karen tried to regain control, talking over them, insisting it was all a mix-up. But the room wasn't buying it anymore. The more she spoke, the more defensive she sounded, and the more people started whispering to each other. By the time the meeting ended, the tension in the room was thick. People were still talking in clusters, shooting glances at Karen, at me, at the rest of the board. I knew something had shifted. She wasn't untouchable anymore. The next morning, I decided I'd had enough of the whispers and dirty looks. It was time to get everything in writing. I walked straight into the HOA office, the place where all the drama seemed to be cooked up. The receptionist looked up at me like she'd just seen a ghost. She tried that fake friendly smile, but it was too late for pleasantries. I asked for a copy of the bills they claimed I hadn't paid. She hesitated, glanced toward the back office, and then said I'd have to speak to the HOA president. So I waited and waited. Finally, out walked Karen herself, that smug little tilt to her head like she was the queen of the neighborhood. She asked if I'd finally come to settle my debts. I told her I wasn't here to settle anything until I saw proof. She rolled her eyes, pulled out a folder, and slid it across the desk. I opened it and almost laughed out loud. The first page had my address, sure. But the account number, the meter readings, even the late fee notices were under her name. Every single page listed her as the account holder. I looked up and asked her why her name was on my supposed bills. She gave this quick, nervous laugh and muttered something about clerical errors and shared services. It didn't add up. Why would my house share a water meter with hers when we lived on opposite ends of the street? Why would trash collection fees from her property show up under my address? The more I asked, the more defensive she got. She snatched the papers back, stuffed them into the folder, and said the matter was complicated. Complicated? It was downright suspicious. I told her I'd be taking the matter up with the county office, and she stiffened like I'd just threatened her throne. Her voice went cold. She said I was overstepping, and that it would be better for me to just pay the balance quietly to avoid more trouble. That last part made my blood boil. I wasn't about to be bullied into paying her bills. When I left the office, I didn't go home. I drove straight to the municipal utilities department. The woman behind the counter there was the complete opposite of Karen, calm, polite, and actually willing to help. I handed over the folder I'd snapped quick photos of on my phone, and her eyes widened. She started pulling up account records, and after a few minutes, she told me exactly what I'd suspected. The HOA had been routing Karen's personal utility charges through the neighborhood's shared billing system. And somehow, my account had been marked as the overflow payer for several of her accounts. It wasn't just water and trash. There were charges for landscaping, pest control, even private security. I asked how long this had been going on. The answer? Over a year. My jaw clenched. No wonder the HOA had been so pushy. They'd been bleeding my account dry to keep Karen spotless. The clerk printed me a thick packet of itemized bills, complete with timestamps, account IDs, and signatures from the HOA's own finance committee. Every page was like a confession. They hadn't even tried to hide it well. It was just buried under legal jargon and complex coding. I thanked her and walked out with a stack of paper, so heavy it felt like I was carrying ammunition. By the time I got home, my mind was racing. I could take this straight to a lawyer. Or I could make sure Karen knew I had the proof before she tried to spin another story. I decided to test the waters first. I scanned every page, saved them to multiple drives, and sent a single, simple email to the HOA board. Please explain why these charges under Karen's name have been billed to my account for the past 14 months. Copies attached. The response was almost instant, but not from the board. It was from Karen herself, and it was short. We need to talk. In person. Today. I sat back in my chair and let out a slow breath. Now she was nervous. That meant the game was shifting in my favor. I told her I was busy and that all communication should be in writing from now on. That's when the flood started, emails from the board trying to downplay it, Karen's frantic attempts to clarify the charges, and finally, a message offering to resolve the matter, if I agreed to keep it between us. But the more they scrambled, the more I realized they weren't just worried about me. They were terrified of who else might find out. This wasn't just a petty HOA mistake. This was a full-on cover-up. And I wasn't going to let them sweep it under the rug this time. By the time the weekend rolled around, I thought things might finally cool down. But early Saturday morning, a loud knock rattled my front door. I wasn't even fully awake, yet when I heard Karen's voice shouting from outside. She wasn't alone this time. 2 of her friends from the HOA board were with her, each of them holding clipboards like they were about to conduct some kind of official inspection. I opened the door just enough to see their faces. Karen immediately started in on me, waving a stack of papers and claiming she had new evidence, proving I owed thousands of dollars in unpaid HOA fees. She said they had cross-checked the records and confirmed that I had been dodging payments for over a year. I asked her to leave the papers on the porch so I could look them over, but she refused, insisting that I sign something right there on the spot. I could tell she was trying to corner me into making a mistake. I refused to sign anything and told her to back up off my porch. That's when she smirked and said, "You'll regret this. You don't know who you're messing with." Her friends looked uncomfortable, but they didn't say a word. The next day, I noticed something strange. My mailbox was overflowing with envelopes from the HOA. Dozens of them, all marked final notice. The problem? Every single one of them was addressed to me, but listed charges for repairs, fines, and fees that had nothing to do with my property. One notice claimed I owed for emergency pool maintenance, even though I didn't have a pool. Another billed me for clubhouse carpet replacement. It was obvious now, Karen had mixed up her own bills with mine. Or maybe she hadn't mixed them up at all. Maybe she had deliberately put her own debts under my name, hoping no one would notice. But the more I thought about it, the more I realized this was her style. She was the kind of person who could twist any situation until it looked like she was the victim. Instead of confronting her right away, I decided to gather proof. I called the HOA's accounting office and asked for a full breakdown of my account. The clerk on the phone seemed surprised when I told her about the unpaid bills I'd been accused of. After a long pause, she admitted that my account was actually paid up in full, and had been for months. That was the moment I knew Karen's game was about to blow up in her face. I asked the clerk to email me a copy of my account statement, and she agreed. 10 minutes later, I had a PDF sitting in my inbox showing I didn't owe a single dime. Better yet, I noticed something on the statement. Several large charges had been removed from my account just days before. The notes said, reassigned to account number 44. I didn't know it yet, but that account number belonged to Karen. Later that afternoon, I saw her standing in her yard talking on the phone, pacing back and forth like she was in the middle of a crisis. She spotted me watching and quickly went inside. That told me all I needed to know. She was rattled. Over the next 2 days, the gossip in the neighborhood started to shift. People who had been whispering about me suddenly started whispering about her. I overheard someone at the corner store saying they'd heard the HOA president was in trouble for messing with the books. I didn't have to ask who they were talking about. Then came Monday morning. A plain white sedan with tinted windows pulled up in front of her house. 2 men in suits got out and walked up to her door. They weren't police, but they carried themselves like investigators. I stayed out of sight, but I couldn't resist peeking through the blinds. Karen opened the door, and the conversation looked tense from the start. One of the men handed her a document, and her expression went from confident to pale in seconds. She tried to argue, waving her arms and shaking her head, but the men just stood there, calm and unbothered. After a few minutes, they left, and Karen slammed her door so hard I could hear it from my living room. I didn't know exactly what had just happened, but I had a good guess. It looked like the HOA's own internal auditors had finally caught on. And from the way she avoided going outside for the rest of the day, I was pretty sure she knew her grip on the neighborhood was slipping. The real turning point came that evening when I got a call from one of the other board members. She told me, in a hushed voice, that Karen had been caught using her position to shift personal bills onto other members' accounts. Apparently, I wasn't the first person she'd targeted. The only difference was that this time, she'd gone after someone who fought back. I thanked her for the information, but I didn't tell her everything I knew. Not yet. I wanted Karen to wonder how much I had on her. And from the nervous way she kept glancing at my house the next morning, I could tell it was working. It was almost satisfying, watching her confidence crack, seeing her carefully built image start to crumble. But I had a feeling this was just the beginning. Something told me Karen wasn't going to back down without one last fight. I woke up the next morning to find an official-looking envelope wedged into my doorframe. It had the HOA's letterhead, stamped in red ink like it was some urgent matter. I opened it, and my jaw tightened as I read. It claimed I now owed accumulated fees for trash collection, lawn maintenance, and even water bills, none of which I was actually responsible for. The strangest part? The account number wasn't even mine. It matched the same number I had seen before on Karen's mistakenly delivered notices. The timing was almost laughable. Just a day after she'd tried parading me in front of the board, they were now trying to bury me in paperwork to make it look like I was financially irresponsible. But something in the letter didn't sit right. The charges went back months before I even moved in, and the service addresses listed weren't my property at all. They belonged to Karen's address, plain and clear. I decided not to react right away. Instead, I tucked the letter into a folder where I'd been keeping every shred of paper connected to this mess. If they wanted to keep playing games, I would make sure I had the full rulebook ready to slam in their faces. And as I skimmed the HOA's bylaws once again, a section caught my eye, something about fraudulent billing being grounds for legal and financial penalties. It was almost poetic. That afternoon, I sat quietly on my porch, sipping coffee, when Karen strutted by, sunglasses on, acting like she owned the street. She smirked when she saw me, clearly expecting me to be flustered. "Get that letter?" she called out in a mock-sweet voice. I didn't answer. I just kept sipping, and that lack of reaction seemed to throw her off. She slowed her walk, tilted her head, and then kept moving. She had no idea I was already a few steps ahead. The next day, I went down to the HOA office with my own folder of documents. The receptionist looked uncomfortable as soon as I laid the letter on the counter. I calmly pointed out the mismatched service addresses, the account number that clearly wasn't mine, and the timestamps showing these charges existed long before I became a homeowner there. She didn't say much, but her eyes darted around like she knew this was bad. I asked her to place an official note on my file that I disputed the charges and had proof they were invalid. She reluctantly wrote something down. When I walked out, I caught sight of Karen in the parking lot, leaning against her car and talking to someone on her phone. Her face shifted the moment she saw me. "You can try to fight it," she said, "but you'll still have to pay. Everyone does." That smug confidence almost made me laugh. I just smiled and kept walking. That evening, I made a few calls. One to my lawyer, one to the city's billing department, and one to the county records office. Within hours, I had official verification that those accounts were tied directly to Karen's property. The city clerk even chuckled when I told her what was happening. "Oh, this isn't the first time we've had complaints about her," she said. "She's been late on payments for years." By the end of the week, I had a stack of signed, dated, and stamped documents that painted a crystal-clear picture. Karen had somehow redirected her own overdue bills toward me, hoping the HOA's system and her influence on the board would make it stick. It was petty, but also incredibly sloppy. One night, as I was organizing all this, my phone buzzed with a number I didn't recognize. I answered, and it was a man who introduced himself as a member of the HOA board, one I'd never spoken to before. He sounded uneasy. "Listen," he said, "I think there's been a mistake. I wanted to tell you before the next meeting. Some of these charges shouldn't have been sent to you." His voice lowered. "I think Karen's been pushing for them, and, well, not everyone's comfortable with it." It was the first crack in the wall I'd been waiting for. If someone from the inside was willing to admit things were fishy, then I had leverage. But instead of showing my hand too soon, I played it casual, thanking him for the update and promising to bring my paperwork to the next meeting. From that moment, I could feel a shift. Karen didn't strut as much. She avoided eye contact when I passed her in the neighborhood. And then, strangely, the HOA stopped sending me any new notices. No apology, no explanation, just silence. But I wasn't done. I knew that kind of behavior didn't just vanish overnight. It meant they were bracing for something, or hoping I'd let it go. And I had no intention of letting it go. This wasn't just about proving my innocence anymore. It was about making sure the person who tried to twist the system to destroy me couldn't pull the same trick on anyone else. And as I sat there, flipping through the now thick stack of evidence, I realized something. Karen's game was about to flip entirely out of her control.